everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going back in time to the turn of the 20th century in America. We'll be looking at the assassination of President William McKinley.
It's a story that I think has a lot of surprising twists and turns.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in school, we learned the basics, McKinley was president, and then he was shot by, Leon Childs. But there's so much more to the story than that.
There is, and I think that's what makes history so fascinating, right?
Totally.
You dig beneath the surface and you find all these, these incredible connections, these unintended consequences.
So that's what we're going to do today.
Absolutely.
We've been listening to this great podcast episode from Wondery about the McKinley assassination. And it's got me thinking about, how much we think we know about history.
Right.
And then we kind of uncover all these hidden layers.
Yeah.
And you start to realize how little we actually know.
It's like an iceberg, right?
Oh, yeah.
You see the tip, but there's so much more beneath the surface.
Exactly. So to kick things off, for those who maybe need a quick refresher,
Sure.
let's set the stage. America in 1901.
Okay.
The country's on the upswing after a period of economic turmoil.
Right.
The Pan American Exposition is in full swing in Buffalo, New York, showcasing all this incredible new technology, this sense of optimism about the future.
It was a time of great technological advancement.
Yeah.
The electric light, the telephone, the automobile, these were all relatively new inventions, and people were really excited about the possibilities.
Right. It was like this era of progress and innovation.
Exactly.
But as we know, beneath that shiny surface,
Right.
there were some serious tensions brewing.
Absolutely.
Economic inequality was a huge issue.
The gap between the rich and the poor was widening, and there was a lot of resentment among the working class.
And then you had the aftermath of the Panic of 1893.
Right, which had really devastated the economy and left a lot of people struggling to make ends meet.
So you've got this backdrop of progress and innovation, but also this undercurrent of unrest and anxiety.
And it's in this context that the story of Leon Czolgosz unfolds.
Czolgosz the assassin. I mean, his story is it's really tragic in a way.
It is.
He starts out as this devout, Catholic, hardworking guy.
Right.
But then he faces a series of setbacks.
He loses his job. He becomes disillusioned with the church. He's drawn to these radical ideas.
And he eventually finds himself drawn to anarchism.
Which at the time was seen as a very dangerous and subversive ideology.
Right, like a threat to the established order.
Exactly.
But for someone like Czolgosz, who felt like the system had failed him,
right.
Anarchism probably seemed like this kind of liberating philosophy.
It promised a world without hierarchy, without oppression, without the state.
It's almost like he was searching for something to believe in.
I think a lot of people are searching for something to believe in, And when they feel like the traditional institutions have failed them, they often turn to something else.
Right. And in Czolgosz's case, that something else was anarchism. And this is where things start to get really interesting.
Okay.
Because Czolgosz becomes obsessed with this idea of propaganda of the deed.
Right, which was this belief that violence could be used to spark a revolution.
Like a wake-up call to the masses.
Exactly.
And it's this belief that ultimately leads him to target McKinley.
And it's important to remember that this was a very controversial idea, even within the anarchist movement.
So Czolgosz isn't just some lone wolf acting on his own.
No, he's part of this broader ideological movement.
Right, and it's this movement that's going to have a huge impact on the events that unfold.
Absolutely.
Now, before we get to the assassination itself,
okay,
there's this one encounter that I just find fascinating.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
Czolgosz goes to hear Emma Goldman speak in Chicago.
Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist.
Yeah, she was like this incredibly charismatic figure drawing huge crowds.
She was a powerful speaker and a brilliant writer.
And Czolgosz, he's completely captivated by her.
He saw her as a kind of guru, a leader of the movement.
But get this, Goldman barely even notices him.
Oh, wow.
Like he's just another face in the crowd.
That's got to be a blow to the ego.
Right, and you have to wonder if that rejection, if it somehow fueled his desire to make a grand gesture.
To prove himself.
To make a statement that would force the world to pay attention.
Yeah, to get her attention.
It's like this bizarre love triangle between Czolgosz, Emma Goldman,
right,
and anarchism itself.
That's a great way to put it.
So he's got this ideology that's telling him violence is necessary.
Right.
He's got this unrequited admiration for Emma Goldman, and he's feeling increasingly alienated from mainstream society.
That's a recipe for disaster.
And that brings us to the assassination itself, which takes place on September 6, 1901 at the Temple of Music. which was this grand building at the Pan American
It
Exposition.
was supposed to be this celebration of progress and unity,
Right, and instead it becomes the site of this national tragedy.
a real turning point in American history.
So Czolgosz, he goes to this public reception where McKinley is greeting visitors.
Right. And he waits in line.
With a concealed gun.
Yeah. And when he gets to the front of the line,
Yeah.
he shoots McKinley twice at point-blank range.
It was a scene of absolute chaos. People screaming, running for cover.
I can't even imagine.
It must have been terrifying.
So McKinley is rushed to a nearby hospital
Right.
where doctors perform emergency surgery,
But they can't remove one of the bullets,
That's
and then
bad.
gangrene sets in.
which was basically a death sentence back then.
Right.
No antibiotics.
Yeah.
So McKinley clings to life for a few days,
Mhm.
but he eventually succumbs to his injuries on September 14th, and the nation is plunged into mourning.
It was a profound loss for the country. And it had a ripple effect that was felt for decades to come.
And as McKinley is lying on his deathbed,
Yes.
Czolgosz is calmly justifying his actions,
He truly believed he was a martyr for the cause, a hero of the working class.
which is just mind-blowing to me.
It is.
Like, how can someone be so convinced that violence is the answer? It's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries, and there's no easy answer.
And meanwhile,
Yeah.
Emma Goldman,
Right,
who Czolgosz had idolized,
right.
she's absolutely horrified by the assassination.
She had never advocated for violence, and she was devastated that this man, who she barely knew, had committed such a horrific act in the name of anarchism.
So you've got Czolgosz, who sees himself as a hero,
Right.
and you've got Goldman, who's trying to distance herself from his actions.
And the anarchist movement is deeply divided. Some people saw Czolgosz as a martyr, while others condemned his actions.
It's just such a complex and tragic situation.
It is.
And it's a reminder that even within a movement,
Right.
there can be these really stark differences in ideology.
Absolutely.
So McKinley is dead,
Yeah.
Czolgosz is in custody,
Right.
and the nation is left to grapple with the aftermath of this horrific event.
And it's in this moment of uncertainty and grief that Theodore Roosevelt steps onto the national stage.
Right. Roosevelt, who was vice president at the time,
Right.
he suddenly thrust into the presidency.
A position he was not necessarily prepared for.
And it's this unexpected turn of events
Right.
that's going to have a profound impact on the course of American history.
Absolutely.
But we'll save that for part 2.
Okay.
Because Roosevelt's story
Oh.
is a whole other deep dive.
I can't wait.
Me neither. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt finds himself suddenly president. He's sworn in, promises to continue McKinley's policies.
Yeah, a lot of people were wondering what direction he would take.
I bet. It's such a contrast, right? You have McKinley, this seasoned politician, and then Roosevelt, who's known for being, well,
Energetic.
yeah, energetic. So what happens next?
Well, one thing the podcast highlighted was Roosevelt's understanding of public image.
Okay.
He knew how to use symbolism, how to project strength and confidence.
And that was important at the time, right?
Yeah.
After the assassination.
Absolutely. The nation was reeling. They needed a leader who could reassure them.
I can see that. So Roosevelt steps in and projects this image of, like, I don't know, like a take charge kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly. He was a man of action,
Yeah.
and he wasn't afraid to use his authority.
Okay, so that's the style, but what about the substance?
Right. Good question.
Did he actually stick to McKinley's policies?
Well, he did initially, but he also brought his own priorities to the table.
It's like, how could he not?
Yeah, he was his own man.
Yeah.
And he had his own vision for the country.
So what were some of those priorities?
Well, domestically, he was a big proponent of progressive reforms.
Wow.
Trust busting, conservation, things like that.
That's a pretty big shift from McKinley's more hands-off approach.
It was, but Roosevelt believed that the government had a role to play in regulating the economy and protecting the public interest.
And he wasn't afraid to go after big business?
Nope, he was known as the trust buster for a reason.
Which I guess is kind of ironic, right?
How so?
Well, Czolgosz, the assassin, he wanted to dismantle the system, bring down the powerful, and yet his actions ultimately lead to this era of reform and government intervention.
Yeah, that's one of the strange ironies of history.
Totally.
You never know what the ultimate consequences of an event will be.
It's like a chain reaction.
Exactly.
One thing leads to another, and you end up in a place you never expected.
And that's what makes studying history so fascinating.
It really is. So we've talked about Roosevelt's domestic policies, but what about his foreign policy?
Ah, yes, that's where speak softly and carry a big stick comes in.
Oh, yeah, that famous quote.
It perfectly encapsulates Roosevelt's approach to foreign affairs.
So what did that mean in practice?
It meant that the United States should be prepared to use military force if necessary.
Like to protect its interests.
Exactly.
But it should also be diplomatic and avoid unnecessary conflicts. So, like, a balance of power and diplomacy.
Precisely.
And were there any specific examples of this in action?
Well, one big one was the Panama Canal.
Oh, right.
Roosevelt was determined to build a canal across Central America.
And that was a huge undertaking.
It was a massive engineering project. And it involved some pretty controversial dealings with the Colombian government.
So he was willing to use both diplomacy and force to get what he wanted.
Yeah, he was a very pragmatic leader. He knew that sometimes you had to play hardball to achieve your goals.
And the Panama Canal was a major strategic victory for the United States.
It gave them control of a vital waterway. And it solidified their position as a global power.
So in a way, Roosevelt's foreign policy was about establishing American dominance.
In a way, yes. He believed that the United States had a duty to lead the world and to spread its values of democracy and freedom.
And that's a pretty big departure from McKinley's more isolationist approach.
It was, but it set the stage for American foreign policy in the 20th century.
Wow, it's amazing to think that so much changed in just a few years. McKinley's assassination was a real turning point.
It ushered in a new era for the United States.
An era of reform, expansion, and global power.
And it all started with one tragic event.
It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
It really is.
One man's actions can have such a ripple effect on history.
It's a reminder that we're all connected.
And that even the smallest events can have huge consequences.
Absolutely.
And that's what makes studying history so important.
It helps us understand the world we live in today.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the immediate aftermath of the assassination, and we've explored Roosevelt's rise to power. But there's still so much more to uncover. Like, what about the long-term impact of the assassination? How did it shape American society in the years that followed?
And what about McKinley himself?
Yeah, how is he remembered today?
These are all questions that we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
So, stay tuned. Okay, so we've talked about the political fallout from the assassination and how it kind of propelled Roosevelt into this new era. But what about everyday people?
Yeah, that's an important point.
Like, how did this event, this national tragedy, how did it affect the social fabric of America?
Well, I think it's safe to say that it had a profound impact. It wasn't just about the loss of a president.
Right.
It was about a loss of innocence. This sense that even in a time of progress and prosperity, violence could strike anyone, anywhere.
I can imagine, especially at a place like the Pan American Exposition.
Exactly. It was supposed to be this showcase of American ingenuity and optimism.
Right, and then suddenly you have this act of senseless violence.
It really shook people to their core.
And it probably didn't help that Czolgosz was an immigrant.
No, definitely not.
Like, I imagine that fueled a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment.
It did. Czolgosz became a scapegoat for all sorts of anxieties.
About social change, about the growing number of immigrants in the country.
Exactly. And it's a pattern we see throughout history, unfortunately.
Yeah, when something bad happens, people tend to look for someone to blame.
And often it's the most vulnerable members of society who end up being targeted.
Right. And it wasn't just about feelings and rhetoric either.
No.
Like, this actually led to real policy changes.
He did.
There was a push for stricter immigration laws.
More surveillance of radical groups.
It's like this one event kind of set off this chain reaction.
And some of those changes, the debate about security versus liberty, those are still with us today.
It's crazy how something that happened over a century ago can still have such relevance to our lives today.
It shows you the power of history.
Okay, so we've talked about these social and political ramifications, but what about the medical side of things?
Ah, yes.
I mean, McKinley's death, despite the efforts of these skilled surgeons.
It really highlighted the limitations of medical technology at the time.
Right, like they could remove the bullet, but they couldn't fight the infection.
Exactly.
And that must have been a huge wake-up call for the medical community.
It was. They realized they needed to do more research, develop new treatments, improve sanitation practices.
And did that actually happen?
It did. In a way, McKinley's death spurred a lot of progress in medicine.
Wow. So even though Czolgosz's actions were meant to be destructive,
Right.
they actually ended up having this unintended positive consequence.
It's another example of how history is full of unexpected twists and turns.
Okay, so we've covered the political fallout, the social anxieties, the medical advancements, but what about McKinley himself?
Yeah. How is he remembered?
I mean, he's kind of overshadowed by Roosevelt, isn't he?
He is, to some extent.
Huh.
But I think he's generally remembered as a decent man, a competent leader who guided the nation through a period of growth and prosperity.
And he was deeply devoted to his wife, Ida.
Yes, that's a really touching part of the story.
It just adds this layer of human tragedy to the whole thing.
It does. It reminds us that these historical events, they're not just abstract concepts,
Right.
They involve real people with real lives and real emotions.
And I think that's what makes this story so compelling.
It's not just a history lesson. It's a reminder of the human cost of violence.
And the interconnectedness of everything.
Exactly.
Like, we started by talking about an assassination.
Right.
And we ended up talking about technology, media, social change, even medical advancements.
It just shows you how history is this tapestry, with all these threads woven together.
So what's the takeaway from all this?
Well, I think there are a few key things to keep in mind.
Okay.
First, actions have consequences, often unintended ones.
Right.
Second, history is complex and messy. There are rarely easy answers.
And third.
We need to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives we're presented with, and to consider multiple perspectives.
I like that.
And I think it's also important to remember the human element,
Yeah.
to try to understand the people behind the events.
That's what makes history come alive.
It does.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything.
I think so.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with me.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into history.